There were places of unspeakable cruelty where the darkest facets of humanity ran rampant, defying even the most macabre of imaginations. The stories that unfolded within these grim confines would cause even the hardiest souls to wince in disbelief. In the history of human suffering, there exists a chapter so abhorrent, so stomach-churning, that it reverberates through time, leaving an indelible mark on our collective consciousness. How did the stories and events that occurred on slave-breeding farms shock and astonish people during that time? Were there any particular practices or acts of violence on these farms that stood out as especially horrifying? Brace yourselves as we unveil the harrowing events that transpired within the haunting realm of slave-breeding farms. During the time before the Civil War, the United States economy was very dependent on slave work. Slaves were used to work in industries like tobacco, cotton, rice, and sugar, which were the main products of the country. Slavery was a big part of how profitable these businesses were. In 1808, the United States made it illegal to bring slaves from Africa into the country. This was in reaction to pressure from other countries and the growth of abolitionist groups. The law, called the Act Prohibiting Importation of Slaves, was to bring the country in line with the world trend of making it illegal to trade slaves across the Atlantic. So the United States had to find other ways to keep its slave population going and maintain a steady supply of workers. Can you imagine a life confined to a meager shack with nothing but a dirt floor beneath your feet? What if every day meant toiling from sunrise to sunset, with exhaustion gnawing at your bones? In a few minutes, we are about to shed light on the cruelties these slaves were forced to face. Since it was illegal to sell slaves to other countries, estate owners started to breed their own slaves within the country. They set up breeding farms where slaves were forced to get together and have babies who would be born into slavery. This method, which was often called natural increase, was a planned way to increase the number of slaves and keep a steady supply of workers for the growing farming businesses. Large-scale breeding farms were set up in Maryland and Richmond, Virginia, both of which are known for this. These farms were vital for making sure that slaves were always available all over the Deep South. Plantation owners in these areas made sure they had enough slaves to work on their farms by having them have children. These breeding farms had a big impact on the growth of the slave population, which went from about 1.5 million in 1820 to about 4 million in 1940, or a 400% increase. People who were forced to work on farms had to deal with hard and humiliating conditions. They were forced to live under a cruel system that took away their basic human rights and treated them more like property than people. Slaves were hurt physically and mentally, lost their freedom, and lived in a steady state of fear and insecurity. Slaves on farms usually worked from sunrise to sunset, 6 days a week, which was a very hard routine. Their work was necessary for the plantation economy to make money, and they were expected to work hard in the fields, grow crops, and do other complex jobs while their overseers kept an eye on them. People who were slaves on farms often did not have enough food. Many people had to make do with small amounts of food that were barely enough to keep them alive. When the property itself was having trouble making money, it was hard for slaves on smaller farms to get any food at all. The slaves' living conditions were just as bad, and most of them lived in small, crude shacks. Most of the time, these homes had dirt floors and did not have even the most basic things or furniture. Slaves on farms were always at risk of violence. The use of force was a big part of keeping control. Overseers were in charge of keeping an eye on slave workers and making sure they worked as hard as possible. Overseers used physical punishments like beatings and whippings to keep slaves in line and make them afraid. Their main goal was to get as much work as possible out of the slaves. They often used harsh methods to meet the demands of the farm owners.